You just turned 31 and you did the thing you swore you wouldn't do. You looked it up. Average net worth by age. And there it is on your screen, a number that's supposed to represent someone exactly like you. $325,000. Take a breath, because that number is lying to you, and understanding exactly how it's lying to you is the actual truth about building wealth in your 30s. That $325,000 figure is the average. The median, meaning the number that sits in the actual middle where half of 30-somethings are above it and half are below it, is $23,093. Not $300,000, $23,000. The average and the median aren't even in the same conversation, and the gap between them tells you almost everything you need to know about this entire decade. Here's why the two numbers are so far apart. Averages get dragged upward by a relatively small number of extremely wealthy people. Someone who sold a company, someone who inherited money, someone who bought the right stock at the right time. Include a handful of those people in any group, and the average balloons while doing nothing to describe what a typical person in that group actually has. The median doesn't get fooled by that, it just tells you where the middle genuinely is. And the honest, unglamorous truth is that the median 30-something has a net worth that would fit inside a decent used car and a slightly better emergency fund. That's not a personal failure. That's simply where most people actually are, and if that's you, you are not behind some secret curve everyone else is ahead of. Now here's the part of your 30s that actually matters more than any single balance you're staring at right now. This is the decade where the math itself changes shape underneath you, whether you notice it or not. Fidelity's widely used retirement benchmark says you should have roughly 1 times your annual salary saved by 30 and 3 times your salary saved by 40. On a fairly typical $58,000 salary, that means going from around $58,000 saved at the start of the decade to somewhere in the range of $170,000 to $200,000 by the end of it. That's not a small jump. That's essentially tripling your savings trajectory in 10 years, and most people don't do it through heroic income growth. They do it because this is the exact decade where compound growth stops being theoretical and starts becoming the majority of the work. Here's the number that should actually motivate you more than any comparison to a stranger's balance ever could. Financial analysts who model this out consistently find that a 10-year delay, meaning simply waiting until 40 to seriously start instead of starting at 30, costs the typical saver somewhere in the neighborhood of $495,000 by retirement. Not because the total years of contributing are that different. Because the specific 10 years you spend in your 30s are the 10 years compound growth has the most remaining runway to work with. A dollar invested at 30 has roughly 35 years to grow before a typical retirement age. That same dollar invested at 40 has 10 fewer years to compound, and at the growth rates we're talking about. Those 10 years are worth almost as much as every other decade combined. This is precisely why your 30s get called the Divergence decade by people who study this closely. It's the point where two people who looked nearly identical at 28, similar jobs, similar starting salaries, similar lifestyles, start to visibly split apart. Not because one of them got a dramatically better job, usually because one of them raised their savings rate as their income grew, and the other one let lifestyle expenses rise to match every single raise, keeping their gap between income and spending exactly the same size it was at 25, just with bigger numbers attached to both sides. The good news buried inside all of this is that the fix isn't complicated, even though it isn't easy. Analysts who've modeled out savings rate changes have found that moving from a 10% savings rate to a 20% savings rate during your 30s can be the entire difference between retiring around 65 with roughly $400,000 and retiring with over $1 million. Not a different job, not a lucky investment. 10 additional percentage points of every paycheck redirected before you get used to spending it, sustained across a single decade. There's also a specific trap worth naming directly, because it quietly derails more 30-somethings than almost anything else. This is the decade of competing priorities arriving all at once. Home buying. often at a median first-time buyer age now sitting around 40. Childcare costs, some of the steepest of any life stage. Student loan balances that are still very much alive for a huge share of this age group. It is completely reasonable that this decade feels financially tighter than either the 20s before it or the 40s after it. The goal was never to do everything perfectly during these 10 years. It was to protect one specific habit inside the chaos, capturing every dollar of employer 401k match and treating any raise as an opportunity to raise your savings rate before it becomes an opportunity to raise your rent. So, if you're sitting somewhere below that median right now, or nowhere close to Fidelity's one-time salary benchmark, here's the honest reframe. You are not behind some story where everyone else figured this out already. Most people in this age group have not. What actually separates the people who end up fine at retirement from the people who end up scrambling isn't where they started this decade. It's whether they used it to raise their savings rate even slightly and let compound growth do the rest of the work while they were busy living the rest of their life. Subscribe if you want the next video where we build the exact savings rate math for your specific income and show you precisely what raising it by even 5% does by the time you're 65.